Hi, I'm Lois Powell. And I'm Susan Schuler, and we're here to share tips, tricks, ideas, and resources to help you discover what's your story.
Hey Lois, how are you?
I'm good, Susan. It's good to be back.
It's great to be back. Tell me a little, what have you been doing in your genealogy? Any good projects?
Oh, there's always projects in genealogy, especially here in Florida when it's so hot. It's nice to be inside researching.
Absolutely. Make any big discoveries
I
lately?
haven't had a lot of discoveries, but when you've been doing it 20 or 30 years, it takes a while to find and break down walls. But don't ever give up. That's my motto.
If you want instant gratification, you should take a baking or some other hobby that's quick painting maybe. Definitely not genealogy.
You'll get instant gratification for your first wave of genealogy.
In 30 years.
And then it gets harder.
Yes,
But
absolutely.
we're not here to discourage you. We're here to encourage you.
Absolutely.
And so today we're going to talk about the 1900 census to the present, because last couple sessions we've done all the earlier census.
Right. Now it's getting good.
Now it's getting good.
So I want to start with the 1900 census.
Sounds good.
Okay, so I have to say, if I had a favorite census, I think this would be it. Not everybody has a favorite census, but I like the 1900 census. It's a lot of interesting information that you don't get on the previous censuses. And also, since there's no 1890 census, you're going a good 20 years, unless you have a state census, before you have some information. New to this census is they give the date of your marriage, and they ask how many years you're married. Right. Also on this census, they ask how many children do you have and how many of them are still living.
Which is really exciting, because I know for myself, I have found, what do you mean there's 6 children she had? I only know about 5.
Exactly.
So you can find, again, there's those little secrets that you don't want to pass by and say, oh, I already know that, because you might not.
Right. For my, one of my great-grandmothers, I want to say 3, but I don't. No, 2, maybe 2 or 3. Anyway, this woman had 13 children. How many of them still living? 6. So that gives you insight into their life. And then it helped me try to figure out, well, who am I missing? I did find 2 children that died very young, but where are those other 4 kids? 5 kids, 3 kids, I don't know.
And you may never find if they were died shortly after birth. They may never have been named. There may never have been a record, but at least you'll have that information to start to keep looking.
The other thing I like about the 1900 census is that it's the only one that says, gives the month of your birthday. So it'd be like August 1860. So that's the only census where you can find that month on there.
Which is excellent when you're searching, because you can find a lot of people born in 1860 might even have the same name. August is going to be a good way to narrow it down.
It also helps you for the tombstone calculator if you want to put in a date, if you know when they died, and then you could put in the month and the year they were born. You get kind of an approximation of their age. What else is on the 1900 census?
Citizenship. All right, now we want to know about the year of immigration. And that's going to help locate passenger ships if you don't know. If you know they immigrated from such and such a country, you can start to narrow down. Naturalization. And there's codes. AL meant you're an alien. Not the way we think of alien and UFO, but non-citizen. A PA means you filed your first papers. It's your first time to apply for naturalization.
Which is a good clue, because it means you have to have been here at least 7 years.
That's right.
To file those first papers.
And then NA is, of course, naturalized. So those are words you need to be familiar with when you're looking, because, again, as Susan just said, that's going to give you tips. And before 1922, women were not naturalized. If the husband was naturalized, she came along as part of the package deal. Unfortunately, it's back to that whole property scenario, which none of us like to think about or talk about. But then it changed.
Right. Because what happened in 1921?
Da-da-da-da.
Women got to vote.
Women got to vote.
So then they wanted to prove that they were a citizen so they could vote.
So pretty exciting stuff. So you're getting a history lesson, too, while you're doing your genealogy.
It's all connected.
It's all connected.
Yes. So women got the vote. Women got their own naturalization papers.
Now, they also asked about military service in the 1900 census. And they asked about property. Did you own? Did you rent? And if you owned, was there a mortgage? Really interesting stuff, because now you can start to look at other types of records and search for your family.
Absolutely. See, it's a good census.
It is a good census.
Not like 1910. 1910 is not a good census.
Why is that, Susan?
Well, it was damaged during the microfilming process, and some of it is completely illegible. I feel if you live in Mississippi, I think that's the one state that's completely not legible at all. So if your relatives lived in Mississippi in 1910, I'm sorry. But a lot of it, not just Mississippi, is hard to read or damaged. Mississippi, though, is the worst.
Part of that's because of the way the microfilming happened. So there's a lot of reasons. A tip would be, if you find it on one website, let's just use an example, you're in Family Search and it's really illegible, try another site. If you're in Ancestry or Find My Past or whatever it is you use, try a different site because they have different software where they can do better enhancements to help. Don't just say, I can't read that, so all is lost. It isn't necessarily all lost. It might be, but not necessarily.
Yeah. And why would you want to pursue it? What's good in the 1910 census?
Well, one thing, military service.
They flat out, go ahead, I'm so sorry.
Sure, they flat out ask, are you a survivor of the Union or Confederate Army or Navy? Why do I want that? It tells me about pension records. So,
for sure.
Very important information if you can find it.
Right. And keep trying.
And keep trying. And then by 1920, now remember, by 1920, we've just come out of World War I. And like we said, this history all ties together with what happens with the dynamics of the census. So I know there were some specific questions that you were mentioning were asked.
Sure. In the 1920 census, and this is the only time this takes place in a census, thank God, children born between January 1st and the date that the census taker came to your house were not listed. So if somebody's baby was born in February and they did the census in April, they're not on the census. And then for people who have passed away, it's the same thing. If you're alive on January 1st of 1920, and then the census taker comes to your house in April, but you died in February, you're on that census. It's very confusing.
That's very confusing indeed. And also there was a question about when they asked about where you came from.
When you if you came from Russia, Turkey, Austria-Hungary, or Germany, they wanted to know not just the country, but the city or the town where you were born or your parents were born.
A bad thing for them to ask, but as a historian, it's a wonderful thing if you can have a town or some more specifics.
Yeah, apparently my relatives didn't listen and answer that properly.
Mine either. All right, so we're moving on to 1930. And again, some of the stuff we're not talking about is because it's in every census. You know, the name, some address information.
Right.
What we're talking about here really is the things that are different to those new censuses coming out.
That make them unique or a reason to pursue researching them.
For example, in the 1930 census, military service now addressed more. Civil War vets, yes. Spanish-American War. Philippines insurrection. World War I. A lot more detailed information. In my case, I found an uncle, and I found the code SP, which was the Spanish-American War. From there, I was able to get into various articles like his pension files, a report from the Adjutant General that described his role in 1898 in the war.
Wow.
I found his gravestone, and I found, therefore, the company that he was in. So just that little SP over in the corner gave me a ton of information.
It's a good clue. It's a very good clue.
What else did they ask in 1930?
What else did they ask in 1930?
Well, I think they asked if you had a radio.
They did ask if you had a radio. Isn't that great?
So
we think that's so funny now.
We wouldn't know why they asked. Maybe they wanted to understand how you got your communication, but
there you go. And then also they asked if you went to college. First time they're asking about more specifically about education,
especially higher education,
right?
And that's probably where higher education started to actually happen.
So absolutely,
it's a big thing for them to want to learn at that point.
Yeah.
Shall we move on to 1940?
I'm ready if you are.
Now, 1940 to me is a really fascinating one. I don't know if it's my favorite because Susan has a favorite, but it's a fascinating one. And keep in mind, again, history. The stock market crashed in October of 1929, and that led to the Great Depression. By 1933, half of all American banks had failed. There was a 30% unemployment rate. And the economy didn't really recover until 1939. So we're talking 10 years of the Great Depression and all things that had to go on until recovery. On top of that, World War II started in September of 1939, even though we as America didn't enter till December of 41. So there's been a lot of churning between 1930 and the 1940 census, and that makes this census quite a bit different.
A lot of economic questions.
A lot of economic questions.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll see in this census something completely unique. By a name, if you see an X with a circle around it, that means that's the person who provided the information to the enumerator. What does that mean to us? It means the information is probably pretty accurate, unless perhaps a child entered the door. Now you might want to question some of the information, because if they're only 9, their perception of perhaps ages or some other things might not quite be that accurate. So you have a way to verify some of the accuracy of information.
Absolutely. Another thing they asked about was, did you live at this address in 1935? So they're trying to see, were you able to stay in your home, or did you have to become a transient? Did you have to move? That kind of thing. Another thing they were looking for, how long did you work? I believe the question on the census is, how many weeks did you work? So they're trying to track unemployment.
And not only did you work, but who did you work for? Because again, the history we just talked about, that was during President Roosevelt. And he had a program, for those of you who know, have called the New Deal. And they were programs to rebuild our infrastructure and to put people back to work. So these are things like the Hoover Dam, the San Francisco Bay Bridge, libraries, schools. So there were different programs for each of those. So they would ask the question of, was the person assigned to public emergency work, such as some of those organizations in the Roosevelt deal? And they asked specifically, did they work March 24 through 30? They want to know if they're working just before the census. Did they work for a profit or in private? A lot of good information there. If you didn't work, were you engaged in housework, schoolwork, or unable to work? If you did work, or were you seeking work, or were you assigned public emergency work? To give you an example, in my family, I have another uncle. I have a lot of uncles. He was the age of 37. He did not work the week prior to the census. He had been unemployed for 202 days.
Aww.
He was assigned to the Work Project Administration, part of the Roosevelt program, as a laborer, and he did road construction. So he worked for 12 weeks in 1939. Really good information, because you start to understand what these people's lives were like, and maybe where you could look for additional information about them, especially if they're unemployed.
Mm-hmm. Other thing they ask on the 1940 census is, did you have a Social Security card or number?
Yes.
Yeah.
And again, very important, keeping in mind all the economy questions. Did you receive an income of $50 or more from sources other than money wages? So a little bit under the table, or did somebody pay you in food? You know,
Yeah.
I mean, who knows how you were paid? Lots of financial, economic types of questions are in the 1940 census. The other thing that's in the 1940 census is supplemental questions.
Mm-hmm.
And this is very unique. This is 5% of the population were asked these questions. Why? Again, you'll understand when you start listening to what was happening economically. And you can tell that in the 1940 census, because on the left side of the form, every so many lines down, and I don't know how many.
Yeah. Or how they picked the people to ask.
It'll say supplemental quest. And if your ancestor was in that supplemental question, go to the bottom of that very page, that form, and that's where the supplemental questions are. So now we're getting back to census questions that were asked at an earlier census. In the supplemental question, they want to know the parent's birthplace, the native tongue, veteran information, occupation and industry information. And for women who were married, had they been married more than once? I don't know why that was important, but it was. What was the age at the first marriage? And if they had children, how many did they ever have born, excluding stillborns? So it's a very fascinating census.
It's short. It really is, and to me, it's like the first modern census.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
The first modern census. Now, if you don't find your family, and they were trying to keep note of families that were absent. You might find them in what we call the ED, the enumeration district pages. So bottom line is, if you don't find your family where you think they are, start flipping through the pages, and the families are ordered by number. If you find a gap in the numbers, you may run into those families written somewhere in the middle. Or if you get all the way through, go to the next page. You may find that there was a break in the normal family, or there wasn't, and they just put them at the end. And if you find them somewhere in those weird places, look in the column of 3, and you'll find the house number, and then you can know where they belong. So fascinating stuff from
It really
1940.
is. Your point about the 1940 census, you're right. If you don't find somebody, keep looking for them. I've read through lots of pages of enumeration districts. I have an example. My uncle, in, I think it was 1940 census in the Bronx, I find his parents, but no children. And then I kept looking and looking and looking at the very last page of that census that lists their kids. How they got separated, I don't know.
Were they absent
But-
that day?
Yeah.
You just don't
Were they at school and the guy forgot them? And I have no, well, I'll never know, but I did find them.
That's the important part.
Yeah, don't give up.
So now the exciting news.
Are you ready for the 1950 census?
Yes, it's coming faster than you think.
Yes, the 1950 census will be released on April 1st, 2022, but it will not be indexed.
Initially.
Right. It will take, so the 1940 census, it took 160,000 volunteers 6 months to index the census. So on April 2nd, don't go to Ancestry and put in your grandfather's name thinking you're going to find him in the 1950 census because it takes time. However, you could find them in the census if you know their address or the enumeration district to where they lived, right? At that point, I think we should say everybody should volunteer to index
absolutely.
the census.
The sooner everybody volunteers, 1, you'll learn a lot,
Yes,
and 2, you'll help it get indexed for all the rest of us
right.
as well.
And just think that's a great way to help all the volunteers who've indexed all the other things that have benefited us.
Absolutely.
Right. So if you're interested in volunteering to be an indexer, you should go to the Family Search Wiki and look up the 1950 census. And then there's a link right there on the page, volunteer.
And if you want to know what's going to be covered in the 1950 census, you can go to NARA,
Mm-hmm.
and they'll show you the form out there so you
Yep.
know what's going to be coming towards you.
Copy of the blank form.
Yep.
Yes. I'm very excited because this is the first time I'll see my mom on a census where she's not a little girl. You know, I mean, think of it in 1950. A lot of those people are still around,
Absolutely.
you know, and that's another good point is that the census is released 72 years after it was taken. That's a federal law. So every 72 years, they'll release the older census. And I wonder if that's going to change as people live longer.
It might,
I mean, the whole reason it was for privacy.
right? Yeah, so we're going to have to wait and see on that one too. But we do know 1950 is going to be released.
Yes.
That's
Very
big news.
exciting. On that one, they might ask if you own a car.
That's true. They
Right?
might.
So we talked about how you have to know your enumeration district. And the best way to find your enumeration district is to go to another website. Do you want to tell us about that?
SteveMorse.org. It's SteveMorse. SteveMorse.org/census. And you can look up the enumeration districts there, and it'll give you a lot of information. If you know the address, you'll find the ED very quickly.
Right.
That's the simplest way. And you might have to look at the address from 10 years ago
And hunt and peck.
and hunt and peck from there.
Right. But that's the best way to be prepared for that with that release of that census.
Absolutely.
Right.
Now, what if you don't find somebody in the census? Should you just give up?
Absolutely not.
Well, there's other alternatives, right?
Mhm. Sure are.
I think we briefly touched on social statistics schedules at our last session because they were run between 1850 and 1880.
Right.
But I will tell you, it's very limited. I found it in Ancestry. Some states had them. Some states had them on some years. Some counties in some states had them. It's good luck,
Yeah.
but it's worth looking at because if you get a hit, you're going to learn a lot.
Yeah. If you get a hit, that's great. But don't go in there with high expectations because not every area is covered. And what are in the social statistics? 3 things. Churches, and the church history and the map of where the church was in the town. Cemeteries, where the cemetery was in the town or the area, which I think is good for both of those because, well, maybe your family lived here, but their religion of their church was way over across town and the other church was closer. They might be going. I mean, if they were walking in the snow and everything, they might have been going to the church that was closer,
Absolutely.
even though maybe it wasn't their faith. The other thing they covered was trade societies, lodges, clubs. So if you know your ancestor was a Mason or belonged to a trade union, this might be a good way to find information on them that you can't find anywhere else.
Really good points.
Yeah.
But there are other ways to look. I think we've mentioned in the past state censuses.
Mm-hmm.
Various states, again, the censuses come and go. They're not necessarily
Yeah.
consistent. There were Indian census rolls, especially 1885 to 1940 was Indian reservation census. There were police census. There were school census.
School census.
In 1930, there was a merchant seaman's schedule.
Oh.
There are mortality schedules.
Mm-hmm. Industry.
Industry,
Right.
agricultural, territorial. So don't give up. Just go in and start looking at the catalogs and do some research in some of these smaller census because two reasons. One, if you can't find them in the census, or two, we said 10 years is a long time between census. There may be other information somewhere in between
Absolutely.
that 10 years.
You made me think of something really crucial, Lois. I think when you use Ancestry, get to know that card catalog. It's the drop down and search, and then put in your state, or better yet, keep scrolling and you'll see the map of the country and you can just click on the state you're interested in and look for the records that are specific to your state. Because there might be a record for Nebraska that, as somebody who does mostly New York research, I don't know about.
Right.
And then if you can't find your people in the census for whatever reason, whether it burned or, your state wasn't a state when you're for the information you're looking for, there are other things to look for, not just a census. We could look for tax records.
Land records.
Voter lists are out there.
And I think we mentioned this before. Prisoners,
Yep.
delinquencies.
Yep.
There are a lot of information that can help fill in some of the blanks if you find somebody is missing and you want to know what happened to them.
Absolutely. Just don't give up.
Don't give up.
Mm-hmm.
Bottom line, that's the real statement.
Yes, you have to be a detective.
And it is fun. It can be
is.
frustrating. But
It
is
can
fun.
be, but it's the thrill of the chase too. It's very, very, very exciting. So I think that's it for this time. We'll be back shortly, another couple weeks with another episode. We'll be moving on from the census. We'll talk about something new. If you have a suggestion for us, please leave it in the comments. We're looking forward to talking about what you want to hear, so let us know.
Been fun talking with you.
Happy
Bye-bye.
hunting.